Good morning, everybody. I am Raul Villegas, and I am the Director in Deals in Corporate Finance and Head of the Strategy Practice Group here at PwC Philippines. I'll be taking you through the webinar series on the first topic, Introduction to Industry Analysis. And with respect to this, I just want to show you that, or share with you some of the feelings that I have with respect to industry analysis. And for you and your teams, I'm actually very excited because I think that in the middle of this competition, as you get deeper in industry analysis, as you learn new things, you and your teams are going to have several, if you can call it aha moments, where you'll learn something new, something will click, and you'll gain a deeper appreciation of what industry analysis is all about and how underlying industry economics drive industry returns. And I remember myself as an undergraduate student many, many years ago, don't ask me how many years, but many, many years ago. And I think that with respect to you and all of your teams, that you have quite an advantage in being able to participate in this program. The reason being is that you are ahead of your peers with respect to getting this knowledge and being able to apply it. And that's really the whole thing about why you're part of this competition. It's to learn new things and to apply that knowledge. And here in PwC, we are all excited to be able to bring to you that knowledge. And of course, later on, we'll be taking your questions. As Jade said, I'll be talking about 40 to 45 minutes about the different parts of industry analysis. And then after that 40 to 45 minutes, you'll have the opportunity to type down your questions in the chat box. And we'll try to get through those questions. And for those questions that we're not able to get through because time is up, certainly we can always get back to you on answering those questions. So I hope you've got your pen and pads ready to take down some questions or thoughts that arise in your mind during this talk. And then we'll dive right into it. First of all, when we talk about industry analysis, I think that it's important to keep in mind what is the end of this industry analysis in the competition. And the end of that, the goal of that, is for you and your teams to come up with a market entry strategy. And this market entry strategy will cover all of the things that you have learned from your industry analysis and the inputs that you get from that. And certainly that's the end product in phase one. So how do you get to be able to do the industry analysis? I think first of all, we have to take a look at the big picture. Industry analysis is a tool. It's to understand how companies get competitive superiority over their competitors in the industry. And the other thing to really remember about industries in general is that each and every industry has a set of constraints or industry economics that actually are very, very rigid in how returns are derived from that industry. Warren Buffett, for example, or to paraphrase Warren Buffett, he has a saying, and he said that, I have seen industries with bad economics and managements in those industries with good reputations try to turn around companies in those industries. And very often, it's the reputation of the industry that's remained intact. So that just goes to show you that Warren Buffett has a very healthy respect for the natural constraints that industry economics imposes on industry returns. And so through the use of all of these different tools, you are going to be able to really understand and get to know how industry economics drive returns and how different companies are able to establish competitive superiority in these different industries. And excuse me for a moment while I take a small drink. One of the things that I want to leave you with when you come up with your market entry strategy is that every industry is different. I think with respect to the outlines of this competition, there are 4 different industries that one can choose to be able to analyze. And the method of market entry is really going to depend on the underlying economics of that industry, whether you will do a greenfield project where you essentially create a business from scratch, or maybe the economics of the industry will demand that you go into a joint venture. Maybe you'll have a strategic partner with an operating expertise, and you will have a financial partner that brings with them financial expertise. Those are some of the different types of joint ventures that one can put together to be able to enter an industry. And of course, perhaps the most glamorous way of doing it is through a business acquisition or a mergers and acquisition transaction. So keep that in mind. Moving on to the next slide. One of the things that you've got to keep in mind with respect to a market entry strategy is that, of course, any company that wants to compete in an industry has their core offering of products or services. And Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, and certainly one of the founders of Netscape, and certainly the founder of Andreessen Horowitz, a very prominent venture capital firm, he is fond of talking about what he calls the product market fit. And he talks about the product market fit. He's talking about a company having a product, and of course, in venture capital, we're talking about a startup. But a startup having a product and then finding the market demand for that particular product. And the whole idea being that a product market fit happens when a startup company is able to put together a product that in a market entry that meets the market demand sufficient enough that they're able to scale it and get big rather quickly. So that's what Mark Andreessen talks about that's what he means when he talks about product market fit. And certainly, of course, with technology and with the internet, that's very, very applicable. One thing that I'd like to leave you with, though, is that with respect to product market fit, in terms of market entry strategy, what we've also got to be sensitive to is inherent capabilities. So in essence, when you're talking about doing a market entry strategy, you've got to look for the intersection between products, market demand, and company capabilities. Because if one is able to find the intersection between product and market demand and company capabilities, you're going to be able to compete very effectively. If you've just got the product and the market demand but lack the capabilities to compete, then you're not going to be able to establish competitive superiority. So that's one thing that I'd like to leave you with, is that in addition to product and market demand, it's very important to have the company capability to be able to execute. Moving on to industry analysis. There are many types of ways to analyze industry. And you'll see that you've got, for example, industry structure competitiveness, competitive strategy, exploration, and even the growth path analysis. One thing that I think is very, very important to note is you should not have a one-size-fits-all approach. Each particular type of industry analysis has advantages and disadvantages. And one of the things that I've learned in the experience that I've had in my career, especially here in PwC, is that what you do, the best practice is to be able to get the best of each particular approach, to be able to use those tools to be able to break down an industry, analyze how companies compete in that industry, and get an appreciation of the economics of each industry. And you'll see that we've highlighted about 6 different approaches. We've got Porter's 5 forces, we've got the PEST approach, we've got the microeconomic analysis approach, the business model canvas, the generic competitive advantage model, and the BCG matrix approach. And we'll get into a little bit of detail with each of those approaches. Suffice it to say that in industry analysis, it's very, very important that while one is analyzing a lot of information, is to have a coherent, logical approach that allows you to provide a certain amount of focus so that you're not trying to boil the ocean. We sometimes make the mistake of doing a lot of analysis without a focused approach, and we end up with a lot of information and data points and maybe analysis that in the end it doesn't fit all that well because there was a scattershot approach of doing that. And I'd like to caution everybody that when you do industry analysis, don't try to boil the ocean. And we'll get into some of the tools and techniques to be able to come up with a more focused approach so that you can use your effort and time more efficiently. Of course, in the real world, efforts are time-bound, there are deadlines, and there are constraints. And we want to be able to give you the tools to be able to meet those deadlines and constraints in the real world. Make no mistake, the tools and techniques that you use in the PwC M&A Challenge are tools and techniques that you'll be able to use anywhere that you go. So pay attention closely. So the first thing that we'll tackle is the PEST analysis, the political, economic, social, and technological analysis. And this allows the industry analyst to be able to get a good overview and appreciation of the, if you can call it, macro forces driving the industry. And in my own experience, taking a look at the PEST analysis, okay, one of the things that I've always sort of come back to is that there are certain large forces that really shape how an industry competes and how the companies within that industry do their business. Just as a quick program note, I think there are some of you that are on the webinar right now that haven't muted your mics, and so that I think it's important for everybody to mute their mics because we're actually getting some feedback on the system. And I think one of the things, if you see your participant name, you should have a red microphone next to your participant name so that we can tell that you've muted your mics. So that's just a short housekeeping thing to keep in mind, and I'd like to encourage everybody to mute their mics. Thank you very much. But getting back to our topic here, excuse me for a moment. One of the things that I've always gone back to are large forces, if you will, that really constrain or at the same time provide opportunities to the competitors in a particular industry. So for example, one of the large forces that is actually quite slow to change and is very important, particularly in consumer-based industries, is demographics. And that's one of the things that I'd like to underline. When I look at social forces, demographics plays a big role. And let me just share with you some of my impressions related to demographics, even as it relates to the Philippines. The Philippines, of course, has more than 100 million people at this point in time. And we are growing at about 1.7% per year. That's actually a very healthy rate of population growth. And it's the reason that we are very attractive as a consumer market for foreign investors. And when we talk about consumer markets, we're talking about fast-moving consumer goods, retail, and the retail industry. We're talking about automobiles and other goods and services that large population need, education, healthcare, financial services, what have you. There's so much foreign capital that wants to come to the Philippines, and certainly the major item that attracts them is our demographics. If you contrast that, for example, with what's happening in Japan now in certain parts of Europe, where there are populations, rather than having positive population growth, they're actually experiencing negative population growth, which actually makes those markets less attractive. Why is that? First of all, there's a strain on the social security payment system because you'll have a smaller, younger population that is supporting an older population. And keep in mind that when you talk about population, the size of your population also determines the size of your customers. It also determines the workers that go into the economy, and it also is a direct relationship with economic activity. So in that respect, the great thing about the Philippines is that, for example, we split the age cohorts in the Philippine economy, and we did an analysis of that. So we took what's the total population of those between 0 and 5 years old, 6 to 10 years old, 11 to 15 years old, etc., etc. For the foreseeable future, the great thing that we're seeing is that each age cohort is actually bigger than the age cohort that is older. And so, for example, as we see the population projections for 2020, we're seeing that the age cohort from 0 to 5 is larger than the age cohort of 6 to 10, which in turn is larger than the age cohort of 11 to 15. And that's a good thing because it means that the population is growing, that there's going to be more customers in the future, and there's going to be more workers entering the economy to be able to provide that spurt of economic activity. So just to recap very quickly, when I look at social factors, demographics plays a big role because that's directly related to the market size for certain types of industries. For political, moving on to the political side, I think when we're talking about what drives profitability and returns, political environment will be directly related to tax policies, for example, here. And then on top of that, we'll also have certain legislation that will impact, for example, how companies price or relate to their consumers. So consumer protection, for example. In the Philippines, tax policy has been very prominent because in the past administration, of course, the BIR took a very strict stance on how to enforce taxes. And the jury is still out as far as how the current BIR will administer the tax legislation, the tax laws in the new administration. We have not a lot of information yet, but certainly indicators are pointing that tax policy enforcement will be a little bit more lenient, or they will approach it from a more common sense perspective. And certainly just highlighting that tax is reflected on the political side, it's also reflected on the economic side here as well. So taxation is a big deal. But for example, other rules and regulations that impact how companies compete. In the healthcare industry, for example, everybody knows about the senior citizens law and how the price discount of 20% on senior citizens when they buy pharmaceutical products directly hits pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical retailers. So that's actually a direct subsidy that is a cost that is borne by the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Now, the pharmaceutical retailers have the advantage there in the sense that they control the channel, and they've actually forced the pharmaceutical manufacturers to essentially shoulder the entire 20% discount. So that's a concrete example of how the political legislative environment hits profits in a particular industry. One more recent example also that we can point to is mining, and how the DENR, under the new secretary, has been very proactive in halting the operations of certain mines because of the compliance record with the environmental laws. So that's another example of how direct government intervention prevents the economic growth, or certainly hinders the economic activity in a particular industry. Moving on to economic factors, I think definitely consumer confidence as it relates to consumption in the economy can be a major factor. But even before that, I think inflation rates with respect to price and interest rates with respect to access to credit. I think when we talk about the consumer sector, the press is fond of talking about how the consumer sector is about 70 to 75% of the Philippine economy. That is correct. There's 70 to 75% of the consumer spending drives the economic spending or the economic activity on the spending side. And that's directly due to our large population. And two of the things that actually spur consumer spending would be inflation rates. In other words, if prices are stable, consumers will be more confident and spend more. But on top of that, if interest rates are fairly low, then access to consumer credit will be easier. And therefore, people will be persuaded, if you will, to spend more and put more on their credit cards. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is that consumer loans have been growing at a very fast rate. Right now, if you take a look at credit card receivables and auto loans, for the last decade, they've grown at maybe 15% per year based on our analysis. And that's a significant growth rate. And you see all of the traffic that we're experiencing now, and everybody gets stuck in traffic, and we all spend hours per day commuting back and forth. Did you know that a lot of that traffic is being driven by the fact that auto sales are up 30 to 35% year on year? And part of the reason that auto sales are up 30 to 35% in recent years is that interest rates are very low. And it's a very competitive automobile market right now where there's a lot of price competition, coupled with the fact that we have a large population base and people are feeling confident. There's a lot of people buying cars, and so there's a lot of traffic being created. And to a certain extent, of course, we don't like to acknowledge it, if you will, but that traffic is also a direct reflection of our economic growth. I mean, we're growing at 6.9% in the first half of 2016, and we're growing faster than China. We're growing faster than China, but not as quickly as India. But we're the second fastest growing economy in Asia right now. And I just want to say as a side note that all of you in your generation are very fortunate to be where you are at this point, is to be entering the workforce or close to entering the workforce at the time that the Philippines is growing its fastest in more than 60 years. The last time that the Philippines had economic growth near 6.9% was back in 1955. So this is really a significant inflection point in the economic history of the Philippines. Now, on the technology side, I think that all of you that I'm speaking to are digital natives, and I think all of you have an appreciation of technology and how it can impact business. And for example, with respect to how technology can be used to regulate energy use and lower costs, and at the same time provide benefit to the environment. I think I read recently that Google is using artificial intelligence algorithms to be able to reduce their energy consumption by about 30 to 40%. And that's a big deal. And with respect to all of you being digital natives, I'm sure that all of you have figured out ways to be able to automate small tasks or work smarter, or to be able to get more out of your schedule and to cram more tasks into a shorter period of time. And so you're going to be using those skills, applying technology to be able to increase your workflow cycle time on a faster basis. And that's all to your benefit. Technology will impact the way that companies do business going forward completely and transform entire industries. And you're very fortunate to be able to participate and be part of the wave in that development. So moving on to the next slide. Okay, everybody talks about Porter's five forces. That's an economic way or a way to analyze the economics of an industry. It came out in the early 1980s, and at the time it was viewed as a very, very new and sophisticated tool of analysis, and certainly it served its purpose well. And when I take a look at Porter's five forces, and to be able to recap it very quickly: threat of new entry or barriers to entry, the threat of substitutes, and the buying power or the bargaining power of buyers, the bargaining power of suppliers, and competitive rivalry. I think that when I take a look at Porter's five forces, based on my experience and the engagements that I have been in, is that the two largest factors that will impact the economics of an industry are really barriers to entry or the threat of new entry. That's one. And the second is competitive rivalry. Everything else, substitutes, suppliers, and buyers or customers, those are secondary. The top two of the five forces, if you will, that really directly affect how industries evolve and how companies try to establish competitive superiority is barriers to entry and rivalry. And really, if you're talking about barriers to entry, taking the case, for example, of the airline industry, the airline industry is very, very difficult to enter because you've got to buy a fleet of planes. You've got to be able to negotiate landing rights if you're a domestic airline, landing rights in a particular country, or if you're an international startup airline, landing rights in several countries. And then on top of that, you've got regulatory and safety issues that you've got to meet, checklists of different safety regulations to be able to meet the requirements of the different airports that you have to land, and because you want to be able to keep your passengers safe. So the airline industry is a very difficult entry or very difficult industry in which to gain entry. And so you can see that the success of any given entrant in the airline industry will be how they can manage their capital expenditures. How can they enter the airline industry and keep their capital expenditures relatively competitive? So that's just one example of how a big barrier to entry really influences the economics of an industry. With respect to competitive rivalry, again, looking at our airline example, airlines have a unique feature in the sense that they have to price their routes competitively against the competition. They're always watching each other, and they have so many portals or channels that they can sell their seats. They can sell it through travel agents. They can sell it through aggregator sites. They can sell it direct on the web, among other channels. And so it's almost like there's perfect price visibility within that industry. And certainly, that being the case, it makes the pricing of seats very competitive. But an additional thing about the airline industry is that when an airplane takes off, and that airplane takes off and it's not full, each seat that has not been paid for by a flying traveler is revenue lost forever. There's no way that an airline can get that revenue back for that seat. It's different, for example, if you're in retailing. If you're in retailing, you have overstock and you can't move goods fast enough. What you'll do is you'll mark it down, and eventually some person likes that discount, they'll buy the inventory, and you'll get something back for that inventory. Their inventory of airlines, it's their seats. And if they can't sell that seat on that flight, that inventory is gone forever. So that just gives you an indication of how competitive it is in the airline industry, because airlines are trying to fly with load factors as full as possible. And what they're doing is they're trying to maximize their revenue per available seat mile. And if they have an empty seat, that is zero revenue per seat mile for all of the miles on that flight. So with respect to the five forces, I would say that the two biggest five forces would be barriers to entry, or the threat of new entry, and the rivalry within that industry. Everything else sort of takes a back seat. And that's an educated opinion from the experience that I've had within within PwC and in my entire career. So moving on to microeconomic analysis and the types of industries that we have. You'll see that we have everything from perfect or pure competition to a monopoly. And this is actually a good slide to take a look at. And I want everybody to pay close attention, because these are industry archetypes that you can say that they're sort of like industry models. But in real life, industries don't fall neatly into those categories. And I want to be able to demonstrate that to you. I want to be able to demonstrate that to you so that you'll get an appreciation of that. So, first of all, let's start with the bottom here, monopoly. And, you know, everybody, when they talk about monopoly, they think about, for example, how PLDT was before. And PLDT was the only phone company in the Philippines, and you had to wait like 16 years before you could get a landline. And I grew up in the generation where you had a party line and you had a rotary dial phone. And so what you would do is like you pick up the phone and then somebody else would be talking, you know, because that's your party line. I don't even know if you know what a party line is, but like you picked up the phone and somebody else was talking, and you'd have to respectfully ask the other party line to get off the phone because, of course, you wanted to use the phone. I mean, I am the generation that sort of bridged that. But in any case, at the time, PLDT was a great example of a monopoly. But let's talk about the real estate industry, because the real estate industry, if you're talking about a monopoly and how it's very impossible to gain entry in a monopoly industry, I would argue that within the real estate industry, there is exactly a monopoly operating right now, and people aren't really very conscious of it. And I would point to the high-end luxury real estate market where Ayala Land has a monopoly. If you think about it, there is no other company that approaches or approximates the monopoly that Ayala Land has on luxury residential real estate. And one of the projects here in Makati, they sold a penthouse apartment for a condominium that's still being built for 477 million pesos to a single buyer from out of the Philippines. Think about it. Ayala Land is the only company that has the ability to command that price and offer that kind of a property within the state market in the Philippines. And they built their entire around that. So that's an example of monopoly within a segment of the real estate industry. And the real estate industry is fantastic for analyzing here in the Philippines too, because moving on to duopoly, okay? If you're talking about duopoly, you think offhand, give me an example of a duopoly. You say, well, I think telecoms is a duopoly. Okay, that's fine. Of course, you've got Smart and you've got Globe. And notwithstanding, for example, what happened with the supposed entry of Telstra as a strategic partner of San Miguel, of course, that didn't pan out. So the telecoms industry is still pretty much a duopoly. But even within the real estate market, there is a duopoly. And where can you find that? Is that within destination shopping malls, I would argue that SM and Ayala Land actually have a duopoly within the destination shopping malls all over the country. And of course, we know their presence can be felt in the NCR. but they've gotten really aggressive in expanding outside the NCR into the provinces. And Ayala Land and SM go head to head in the mall space. Of course, a third player is Robinsons, and that's certainly something to be considered. But in terms of actual brand visibility, I would say that the mall space really has Ayala Land and SM. With respect to the oligopoly, again, the real estate business has a great model for being able to have within that overall space segments where there's a monopoly, duopoly, and oligopoly. And I would argue that in the oligopoly portion, the space that is occupied by the real estate companies that offer condominiums to middle-class buyers and OFWs, and there are a lot of them. You've got the Avida brand of Ayala. You've got SM. They've got the SM Community brand. And you've got also DMCI offering the same type of product. You've got Empire East that offer the same types of product. Very difficult to enter that industry. You don't do a real estate project, high-rise condo project off the bat. So it's very difficult. But there are certainly a larger amount of players in an oligopoly as compared to a duopoly or a monopoly. Again, high barriers to entry and fairly set amount of competitors, but certainly not one or two, but a fair amount. Now, moving on to monopolistic competition. The condition of entry, it says here it's free or easy. I would say that it's not necessarily free or easy, but certainly those barriers can be overcome. And then seller concentration, non-existent or low, and certainly product differentiation, products are close substitutes. I think, for example, one of the industries that qualifies as monopolistic competition is automobiles. If you take a look at the automobile industry, we have so many brands in the Philippines, and the entire industry is growing 30% year on year. You've got the market leader in terms of volume, Toyota. You've got Mitsubishi, you've got Kia, you've got Hyundai, you've got Isuzu, you've got the European cars, of course, BMW, Benz, you've got the American cars, Ford and Chevy. So many different brands, so many product assortments that customers and consumers can choose from. And people might argue that the automobiles are not close substitutes. But certainly, I mean, if you're talking about getting from point A to point B on four wheels, I mean, compact sedan will get the job done just as well as a four-wheel SUV. And it's really just a question of how comfortable you are or how happy you are in getting there. But certainly they do provide the same type of product enjoyment or product utility, if you will. So that's an example of monopolistic competition. And how easy is it to enter? Well, certainly it's not completely easy, but it's doable. Recently, Ayala actually partnered with Volkswagen to be able to bring the brand back to the Philippines. And so there are other Chinese brands, BAIC, for example, that have come into the Philippines. I think BYD is also a Chinese brand that has come into the Philippines. So they take a look at our 100 plus million market, our rising GDP and our rising GDP per capita, and they say, and they look at that and then they say, that's a market that we want to be part of. So definitely within the auto industry, that can be viewed as monopolistic competition. Perfect or pure competition, hardly any barriers to entry. All of the products are homogeneous and, a lot of different types of sellers. One easy example to point to with respect to perfect or pure competition would be cell phone or tablet peripherals, accessories. I mean, you go to Divisoria or Green Hills, cell phone accessories, covers, screen protectors, etc., etc. They're a dime a dozen. You can get pretty much the same kind of product anywhere for close to the same price. So that's an example of perfect and pure competition. So if there's one thing that I'd like to impress upon people in this particular type of analysis, this microeconomic analysis, is that the real world does not fit neatly into these archetypes. And the other thing that I'd like to leave you with is that with respect to the size of certain industries, for example, the real estate industry, the entire industry doesn't fit neatly into a certain kind of market structure. But certainly one can see that given the size of certain industries, there are segments that, for example, mimic monopolies or duopolies or oligopolies. So that's just something to consider and to be sensitive to. Okay, moving on to the business model canvas. One thing about the business model canvas is that it's very, very important to get an appreciation of how companies conduct their business and what type of business model they have. Because the type of business model that a company has that is present within the context of the industry in which it competes has a big influence and a big factor, and is directly related to how well the company competes in the industry and how much returns it's able to generate within that industry. Said simply, a company's business model is how a company brings its product or service to the market, engages with its customers and buyers, and generates revenue and profit from providing that product or service. And you'll see here the different parts of the business model. Key activities, what's the value proposition, definitely very important customer relationships, cost structure, how they bring that product to market or service to market through channels, et cetera, is the business model will drive the financials of the company. And I myself, if I take a look at the different companies that I've analyzed in the past, I think there's a hint that I can give you with respect to the business model, is that when you do the financial analysis of a particular company, or when you analyze a particular company, don't have a preconceived notion of a company's business model just because they have a very slick marketing program, or they have a lot of reputational information that you can sort of look at and say, oh, this company, its business model is like this because they do this. And I get it. I understand completely. Very often what will happen is when you do an in-depth analysis of what that company is doing and couple that with a financial analysis of their results, you'll find that their business model is quite different from your initial impression. So what I like to be able to do to be able to shortcut the process is to take a look at the implied business model of the company just from initial impressions. Make a hypothesis of the company's business model. But then what I do is when I do the financial analysis of the company and take a look at their metrics and all of the different types of measures that we use, very often the data will either confirm or not confirm that initial hypothesis. And that's very useful because when you get a non-confirmation, then you're in a position to be able to revise your hypothesis and zero in and target on exactly what kind of business model the company is following. So very quickly from this is remember how a company's business model is structured and its main activities will drive the returns of that particular company within the context of the industry. It's not good to say or assume that you know a company's business model right off the bat. What you do is make a hypothesis, take a look at the data, and after your analysis, see whether that analysis shows that that hypothesis is confirmed or not. And if that hypothesis is not confirmed,
than zero in on the actual business model of the company. Moving on, Porter's generic competitive advantage. And what we have here is really sort of like a matrix where you have a broad target versus a narrow target. And we'll explain what this means versus a low cost or differentiation strategy. Broad target means that, for example, in this case, in the automotive industry, you are looking to, if you're an automobile company looking at a broad target, you want to be able to have a wide span of product. Okay. With respect to a narrow target, what you're looking for is, I don't have a wide span of automobile models, but I have a very targeted selection of automobile models. On the part of low cost versus differentiation, differentiation means that the company is competing on factors other than price. And what they're saying is, we're the top luxury car, or we're the top green car, or we are the top performance car. Those are types of differentiation that automobile companies want to really show their customers and hit their target markets. On the other hand, a company that is focused on low cost is really more competing on price. And so if you take a look at the segments of this particular matrix, each particular segment, as it relates to the intersection of low cost versus differentiation and broad target versus narrow target, produces a certain type of strategy, or identifies a certain type of strategy that you can relate automobile brands to. So for example, cost leadership. Hyundai has a very, very wide assortment of models, from small sedans all the way up to large SUVs and even luxury sedans. So they have a broad target approach, but they position themselves as a low-cost competitor because within each of the different types of classes of automobiles, they are arguably a low-cost competitor, or try to achieve cost leadership in those segments. On the other hand, if you talk about BMW, certainly, I mean, BMW has everything. They've got everything from motorcycles all the way up to small sedans, small SUVs, up to the flagship 7 Series and the new 8i series. And the thing about this is, BMW is pursuing a differentiation strategy, and they're saying that we are a top luxury performance automobile. But because they have a wide selection of automobiles, they're a broad target type of automobile company focused on the luxury segment. On the other hand, if you take a look at the narrow target companies, under cost focus is Isuzu. The reason for that is Isuzu is more focused on what they call the commercial vehicle space, where you have the pickups, you have the SUVs, and they try to establish cost leadership in that particular market segment. Contrast that with Tesla, which has a very, very narrow target, but in relation to that target has a differentiated strategy, which is electric green car for the digital native, if you will, focused on high performance, and really they just have maybe 2 sedans and 1 SUV. So that's an example of a very narrow target with a differentiation focus. Even more narrow targeting, for example, is Bugatti with its Veyron automobile. I mean, that is an example of a very, very narrow target of a high performance automobile directed at luxury car buyers with an unlimited budget, but they're not really looking at Bugatti as a car. They're looking at it as an experience. Now, the thing is, this particular model, or the Bugatti Veyron, it has a particular feature where you actually have to override the speed limit of the car to be able to get that to go to 250 miles an hour, for example. If you think about it, why does a car need like a special switch to be able to hit 250? Why don't they just leave it so that it can hit 250? That special switch to hit 250 is pure marketing. They don't need that switch. That special switch is a differentiation. It says to the discriminating car buyer, hey, we've got this switch that can let you do 250. But if you don't want to hit 250, you don't have to flip the switch. I take a look at that and I say, that's pure genius, because you don't need a switch in any car to be able to hit 250. You just press the gas. But, the luxury car maker said that's our differentiation strategy, among other things, in that high performance category. And it pays. I mean, that's a car that costs over $2 million, and there's a waiting list to be able to buy that car. So again, very quickly, just to recap, those are some of the examples for broad target versus narrow target, intersected with low-cost strategy and differentiation strategy. Moving on. Okay, this is the BCG matrix. And the BCG matrix, it looks kind of different in the sense that, it almost looks like you've got planets in this graph, but actually the planets are representations of companies. And in this case, what we've got is on the vertical axis, you've got the company growth rate. And on the horizontal axis, you've got the relative market share. And the size of the bubbles indicate the amount in absolute terms of EBITDA earned in 2015. And this is just a sample of different disguised retail companies. And when you take a look at this chart, it's very helpful because immediately one can see that this particular retail company has a high growth rate, but it actually has a low relative market share. These companies, this one here, has a low growth rate, but relatively larger market share. And these companies, more mature, have larger market shares, but low growth rates. And so you take a look at that, and the thing to do is, and we'll see it in a later slide, is when you're analyzing this type of a situation, what I call three-dimensional graphs are great because they help you to isolate information fairly quickly. What this graph tells me is this particular company here, the retail company, is growing fast. Why is it growing fast? What is it doing differently compared to retail company X and this particular retail company here? Why is it growing fast? And chances are, if it's growing fast, it's probably going to migrate over here. And it's going to gain share over time. And then maybe as it matures and it gains share over time, the growth rate will slow and it'll probably migrate down here if it gains enough share. So looking at this on a snapshot basis, it's a great tool to be able to see who's growing quickly, who's more profitable based on the size of the EBITDA bubbles. And at the same time, it also shows the market leaders. And what this tells me, just looking at this, is the market leaders are fairly comfortable. They have a large market share, but they probably got to watch out for this company here because it's growing fairly quickly. If I were these guys, I would actually wonder, what's this retail company doing that is growing very quickly? And what can I do for my operation or certain segments of my operation that would allow me to jumpstart my growth? So this is just a good way of using the tools in this three-dimensional graph, even though it's represented in a two-dimensional space, to be able to get information fairly quickly and be able to figure out who's growing quickly and who's the most profitable, and who are the outliers to be able to figure out what they're doing that the other companies perhaps are not doing. Okay, market entry strategy. This is what I was talking about earlier. You want to be able to analyze who the outlier is, who the leaders are, and who the laggards are. Because when you take a look at this type of three-dimensional graph, the bubble chart, this tells you immediately that this is the outlier company. What are they doing differently to grow? I take a look at this company too, and I think to myself, their market share is this much. How come they're not growing? What mistakes are they making that I want to be able to stay away from? So just because you can learn from a market leader or a fast grower, I'm sorry, market fast grower. That also doesn't mean that you can't learn something from a company that's not doing so well. Why is this company experiencing a negative growth rate? What are they doing that I don't want to do? And again, this type of chart is very helpful to be able to isolate those variables fairly quickly. Okay, benchmarking. This is a very, very important exercise. And, you know, I want to stress the importance because in the first cutoff, this is actually the part that is going to have the most weight in the scoring. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is it's not enough to do the financial benchmarking and have this beautiful spreadsheet and then have all of these numbers. What you have to be able to do is to link your analysis of the metrics to the business model and relate that into the context of the industry. The metrics themselves are signs of certain types of corporate strategy. They're like signs of behavior. They're signs of decisions that management is making. What you've got to do is you've got to get behind the numbers and understand why the numbers are that way. The numbers are this way because the business model is like this, and management has decided to pursue this type of a corporate strategy within this industry, for example, that's like an oligopolistic industry. That's the kind of linkage that you should be seeking to do with respect to the starting point of the financial ratios. And of course, we're not going to go into the specific types of formulas that you'll use, but suffice it to say is it's very important to understand companies' profitability, how it's being financed, the liquidity, in particular, the use of working capital, and then, of course, the activity ratios. The working capital and the activity ratios, they're all going to be intertwined. And of course, you want to be able to do a horizontal and vertical analysis. Vertical analysis meaning margins, horizontal analysis meaning rates of change. And the thing is, again, I talked about analyzing the outlier earlier. When you do your market entry strategy, particularly on the benchmarking mode, you want to be able to go over the metrics of the market leader, and you want to be able to go over the metrics of the market laggard, and you want to be able to go over the metrics of the outliers. There may be certain types of outliers there that are not limited to the market leader and the market laggard. The thing is, you'll learn something from studying the outliers. And in so doing, you can build a hypothesis about why companies are doing what they're doing in that particular industry. I can't stress enough the importance of understanding and learning from the behavior of the outliers, because that's something that we do here in practical terms within our project engagements. Okay, industry drivers. This is something that certainly a way of thinking that you can use to be able to help you to get smarter about how you analyze certain industries and get more efficient in analyzing companies. And I think that most of you probably have heard about Pareto's Law. And Pareto's Law is pretty much a statement that says, for example, in a particular customer-based business, 20% of your customers will drive 80% of your profits. Or another way to think about it would be 20% of your customers will drive 80% of your complaints. And it's true in science, it's true in everyday life, and it's definitely true in business. And in particular, with respect to industries, I would say that 20% of the factors in a particular industries drive 80% of the profit in that particular industry. And what we took a look at here or chose to highlight is really airlines. Now, with respect to airlines, of course, what we did was we subdivided. You've got revenue from passengers, you've got revenue from cargo, and then under the cost drivers, you've got the fleet and the fuel. And that's a nice subdivision. But in airlines, there's really only like 3 or 4 things that drive 80% of the profitability of airlines. Okay, you don't have to look at the entire P&L because you already know it in advance. First is, for example, the cost of the fleet. The capital expenditures will be a major driver of an airline's return. On top of that is fuel. Fuel is a big deal, of course, because you can't fly an airplane without jet fuel. And in the last couple of years, airlines have been doing fairly well because oil prices have been fairly low. And that's great for airlines, not great for the oil producers. But if you take a look at revenue from passenger movement and revenue from cargo movement, all of that can pretty much be summed up into load factor. The load factor is the percentage of the plane that's full anytime the fleet is in operation. So that's something that the airlines pay close attention to. So the top 3 things that drive the returns in the airline industry are load factors, the cost of the fleet, and fuel. Everything else is minor. And you'll find that reflected across many different industries, in that there's only like 3 to 4 things that you've got to watch out for, and you'll get a handle on the profitability or the return of that industry. And so that's one way to be able to, again, avoid boiling the ocean. You want to be very focused in your strategy so that you won't get into a position where you're going to be doing unnecessary work. You want to be able to focus your efforts efficiently so that you are able to extract the right kind of findings from your analysis. This is a chart that I use this a lot. And I can't claim credit for inventing it, but it's a very, very useful chart. And this is an actual representation of an industry. I won't say what industry it is. And it shows 3 things. First of all, the vertical axis is the compounded annual growth of the revenues for the last couple of years. Okay. Second is the horizontal axis shows the EBITDA margin. EBITDA, of course, being the proxy for cash flow, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So, for example, a company up here is growing quickly, right? And further to the upper right-hand corner, it's growing quickly and it has high margins. Company down here is not growing as quickly but has fairly decent margins. Okay. Now, the third dimension of this chart and why it's so useful is that the size of the bubble is the EBITDA of that particular segment. And so in this particular area, larger bubbles indicate segments with larger cash flow. Smaller bubbles, smaller cash flow. Now, I take a look at this chart and immediately a couple of things pop out, and this is so useful to industry analysis, is I take a look at segment 11 and say, this company is a high growth, high margin company. That is a great opportunity. I wonder what segment that company is in and what it's doing to be able to grow very quickly with such a high margin. That's the example of looking at the outlier. Then over here, we'll see that in the larger portions, perhaps on the more mature portions, you'll see that, yes, the EBITDA bubbles are very, very large, very profitable, but they're not growing as fast. So the question that I would ask here is, okay, this company is not growing as quickly, but why are the margins so generous? What is it about segment 1's operations that are noteworthy that they can have such high margins, right? And then over here, if you take a look at segment 7 or segment 9, then the question is, I take a look at segment 7 and segment 9, and I say those segments are very profitable because the EBITDA margins are fairly large. But then, if you take a look, they're not growing as quickly, and their margins are not that large. But at the same time, they have a healthy amount of EBITDA. So, again, being able to present data in a different way by using the tools of data visualization actually helps to make analysis faster because you're not confined to a two-dimensional view. And that's one of the things that I would urge you digital natives to be able to explore is don't underestimate the value of data visualization. Because if you can come up with a way to represent data that allows you to make an instant analysis just by looking at it, then you're way ahead of the field. And so that's one area that I think that charts like this, tools like data visualization, those help in being able to speed up the process of understanding and analysis. And then in the end, what are you trying to do? You're basically trying to, again, come up with a way of analyzing the industry and how companies compete in that industry, to find the gaps in that industry so that you can come up with your market entry strategy, okay? Whether it's a business acquisition, a joint venture, or a greenfield project.